This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. Being the terribly clever souls that I know you are, I know you won't be surprised to learn that so many of the environmental initiatives that we're familiar with around this neck of the woods, like protecting bears, protecting forests, protecting coastal waters, those initiatives are funded, oddly enough, by enormous, huge agencies in America. And often those charities, I say charities, you'll find out why, are often attached to very familiar names of billionaire industrialists like the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, Hewlett, Packard, and so on. Would it also surprise you to learn that somehow our good mayor, Mayor Robertson, is somehow intricately involved in all of that? Is it possible that the great American capitalists are really not so much interested in protecting Canadian lands and animals and waters as they are making sure that only they get to have oil? Is this too paranoid a thought? I don't think so. Vivian Krause is a regular contributor to the Financial Post. She also is a well-known local blogger, and more than anybody I know, she has chronicled these stories, and this is a rarity these days, with precision. In other words, she does her research. Hello, Vivian. Nice to see you.
Hi, David.
Let's start. We'll save the mayor for the second half of the program.
Sure.
Let's start with this, U.S. Greens shut down Canadian oil, that headline.
Sure. Well, David, environmental activism is really important. We need activists to keep government and keep industry on their toes.
Right.
And not that long ago, actually, environmentalists really had virtually no money. In the early 1990s, there was a big campaign against clear-cut logging on Vancouver Island. And back in those days, the environmental activists were really working out of their own kitchens and with very little funding at all. But that's changed. And what we're seeing now is that the environmental movement is funded to the tune of about $3 billion a year.
Wow.
Yeah, and what I've traced on the basis of my research into American tax returns is that there's a group of very large foundations. They have about $50 billion in assets, and they give away about $3 billion every year. And they have become an important source of funding for the Canadian environmental movement. I've traced almost $500 million over the last decade that's come from American sources into Canada.
You have said, in plain English, for the Canadians on the front lines of environmental conservation initiatives, it's all about saving the bears, caribou, salmon, and so forth. But for the U.S. foundations that fund these initiatives, this is about oil.
Yeah. Well, the Canadian environmental activists on the front lines of these environmental campaigns are just as Canadian as I am, but their big American funders aren't. And if you read actually the strategy papers and the documents of the large American foundations, what they're trying to do is to create large conservation areas as a way to keep large blocks of land off of limits to the energy industry, not only oil, but also coal and natural gas.
Why would someone like Sun Oil put $57 million into the Canadian Boreal Initiative and so on? And what is this paper called Securing America's Future Energy?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't actually Sun Oil directly,
but the family.
The Pew Charitable Trusts, which of course was created by one of the founders of Sun Oil. The Pew Charitable Trust and other American foundations, including the Silicon Valley Community Trust and the Hewlett Foundation and others, the Rockefeller brothers, they are funding an initiative called the Canadian Boreal Initiative.
Yes.
And it seeks to put 1.4 billion acres, that's 40% of the entire national territory of Canada, off limits to roads, mining, energy development, forestry, and so forth.
Now, a lot of people listening to this, watching this, will say, well, that's good. That's a good thing. We want to protect. We want to save. We are, at heart, I think all British Columbians are tree huggers of one kind or another.
Including me.
Yeah, in our souls. So a lot of people would say, what's wrong with that? But you say the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, for example, are only against the tankers that would export Canadian oil to Asia.
Exactly. The issues here are the integrity of the science and a lack thereof. Secondly, the fairness and the unfairness of some of these campaigns, and the lack of transparency. My main concern, and the reason I started looking into this, was because I found that these American foundations were funding environmental research in the name of science, but that this was being done as part and parcel of these media campaigns to sway investment capital, sway market share. So they were funding studies and then publicizing them wildly as a way to influence public opinion. Two examples. One, the campaign against salmon farming, against farmed salmon. So the studies of contaminants in farmed salmon and sea lice were widely publicized, and the organizations that did that were funded as part of a campaign to prop up the market for commercial fisheries. So actually, it's a campaign to foster the market for wild fish, and by beating up the competition, which is the aquaculture industry.
Our federal energy minister has said that Canada loses about $1 million a day because we undersell our oil.
It's about 50 million a day.
50 a day.
Joe
Pardon
Oliver
me.
pegged it when he was here in Vancouver a few months ago, pegged it at $50 million a day, 18 billion a year. Yeah, exactly. When you look at aquaculture, I mean, Canada has the largest coastline in the world.
Yes.
We're right next door to the single largest seafood market in the world. If aquaculture in Canada would develop, it would pose a serious threat to the Alaskan commercial fisheries. But of course, what has happened is, since the campaign against salmon farming, the ex-vessel value of Alaskan salmon has quadrupled. It's gone from 125 million to more than $500 million. And the Alaskan commercial fisheries have got their market back, the market that they had lost over the 1990s to aquaculture.
So much of your writing on these subjects, Vivian, which is really, I think, important and really sharp, is very evidence-based. It's very much about, I looked at the tax records and so on. But every so often, you also talk about the optics, and the optics are no silly subject. For example, in your piece called Rockefeller's Behind Scruffy Little Outfit, you talk about an organization called 350.org.
Yes.
Okay, and you say 350.org has the look and feel of an amateur grassroots operation, which of course immediately our hearts go out to.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's hardly that at all.
Yeah.
It's a highly organized, hugely funded initiative.
Exactly. Well, you're talking about that campaign of Bill McKibben.
Yes.
And he has said that, he started with no money. Just,
me and a couple of guys.
Yeah, 5 or 6 students.
Yeah.
Well, I've traced more than 100 grants, totaling more than 10 million, including 6 grants for more than $1 million each. When I wrote to Mr. McKibben and asked him about his funding, he wrote back and said, well, really hadn't had much at all. He didn't even mention the foundation that has been paying him director's fees in the tens of thousands of dollars and contributed more than $1 million to his campaign. So I think the issue is fairness. When people know that these environmental campaigns are funded by the likes of Warren Buffett and the Rockefeller brothers, I think that people's expectations of accuracy, of scientific integrity, of fairness will be higher, and that's fair.
It looks like a lot of people these days can put on a pair of jeans and a sports shirt and get up on a big stage with television cameras and a body mic and say almost anything, and they look cool. If they don't disclose how they're actually functioning and the wealth that is actually pouring into the organizations that they represent, it's a bit of a scam.
Well, I think it's a tragedy in the sense that, there are real environmental problems. Take Africa, for example. In 2011, 25,000 elephants were
Right.
killed for their ivory.
Right.
The elephant population is being decimated. There are real problems out there. I worked with the United Nations all through the 1990s, 6 years in Guatemala, then 5 in Indonesia. I've seen the real need around the world for international philanthropy. And I don't think that Canada is the place where the Americans should be spending, something on the order of $50 million a year. I think Canada should be on the giving end of all this philanthropy, not on the receiving end. But what I'm seeing, especially through my lens of having worked with the United Nations for over a decade, is that American philanthropy is being used as an instrument of foreign policy. The same foundations that are funding environmental conservation initiatives are also funding a massive program to foster U.S. energy security, U.S. national security, and the competitiveness of the U.S. economy. So what we need to ask ourselves is this: whether it is their intention or not, okay, some of the very large campaigns like that they're funding, like the campaign against tanker traffic, okay, would block Canadian energy exports to Asia.
Right.
That fosters American energy security by continuing the U.S. monopoly on Canadian oil exports.
We've got 2 or 3 minutes before our break. Talk about the Oak Foundation, because it's one of the examples that you use to talk about damage control, about how the moment anyone starts to expose how these folks operate or question, they withdraw crucial lines in their public statements.
Well, I wrote a piece for the Financial Post which was
Right.
headline Damage Control. And what I described in it is how, since I started sort of tracking the funding from these environmental foundations, 17 of these foundations and organizations have rewritten their grants after the fact or removed information from their websites that, details what they were
Like
actually
what,
funding.
for example?
Well,
What are
for
they
example, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, okay,
Yes.
which has poured $115 million into the environmental movement here in British Columbia. It funded a thing called an anti-farming campaign. The U.S. tax returns said that the purpose of that campaign was to shift consumer and retailer demand away from farmed salmon. And the key part of that campaign was the publicity of science, using scientific messages in order to get media coverage, okay? When I inquired about that campaign, the foundation rewrote 4 grants, which were for more than $3 million for the campaign against salmon farming. So I think, these foundations, because they give away $3 billion a year, they're working in a concerted fashion, they're having a very significant influence on our country, I think it's fair to inquire about what they're actually doing.
You talk about $30 million going to Tides Canada from one organization, and almost in the same breath you talk about an organization that got close to $300,000 called Forest Ethics. But this is the crucial line. Forest Ethics is not and has never been a federally registered charity in Canada. Tides Canada paid $780,000 plus to Forest Ethics Canada, quote, for capacity building support.
Yeah. Well, Forest Ethics, the concern I have about them is, they've been an intervener in the hearing against Enbridge and over the Northern Gateway, right?
Yes.
Now, that process is supposed to look at input from all sides, from all voices in Canada in a fair way. But Forest Ethics has reported to the U.S. Internal Revenue Service that they want to stigmatize the Canadian energy in a negative way. So from the get-go, they have a position against Canadian energy. And they have $1 million budgets. They have spend more than $1 million in British Columbia on their program a year. So it's important to know that the Forest Ethics is part of this large campaign funded and coordinated by the Rockefeller brothers to block oil tanker traffic. But the interesting thing is, it's only on the strategic north coast of British Columbia. Never mind the dozens of tankers that import oil into the U.S. on a daily basis. Oh no, the only tankers that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund wants to stop are the tankers that would take Canadian energy to Asian markets.
It shows you the power of language. Forest ethics, it sounds so wonderful. We have to take a little break. If we're not arrested by the CIA during the next 30 seconds, we'll be back. Your opportunity to go to our website, davidberner.com. We welcome your comments and feedback or questions or whatever, and also a chance for the good folks who help us put this program together here to say hello on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. the Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. Our guest is Vivian Krause, and she's a regular contributor not only to her blog, but to Financial Post and other papers and journals. Let's move on. We're talking about the enormous influence of multi-million, multi-billion-dollar American charities on the Canadian scene in many different ways. Now, we have a mayor here in Vancouver named Gregor Robertson, and when he's not, sponsoring more food trucks and more bicycle lanes.
I quite like the bike lanes, David.
They're fine. I just like another legacy besides that. The bike lanes are fine, but could we have something else beside that? Anyway, he's on record as he's against tankers and so on. Well, that's fine. But you have written on your blog several pieces about how the mayor is funded. Mm-hmm. And you talk a lot about the Enswell Foundation and Tides Canada, and you have chronicled exact amounts that have gone in one way or another from those sources to either Vision or the mayor personally.
Yeah. Well, here's my question, okay?
Yes.
I've traced about $500,000, $520,000,
Yes.
okay, that has benefited Mayor Gregor Robertson's political career, both with the NDP and with his municipal party, which is Vision Vancouver.
Right.
Okay? Now, my question is, now that money comes from a series of so-called investment firms and PR firms and individuals who are affiliated in various ways with two charities,
Yes.
Tides Canada and the Enswell Foundation, both of which are part of the network of the U.S. Tides Foundation.
Yes.
Now, my question is, that money that came, this $500,000, that came primarily from these investment firms and these PR firms, did it originate indirectly from the charities?
Or?
And the reason I asked that question is because I was actually, this was while I was still trying to follow the money trail on the salmon farming controversy, and I noticed the name Interdependent Investments in some tax returns. And a few days later, I was actually looking at a database that Chad Skeleton from the Vancouver Sun had put together, and I happened to notice the same name, Interdependent Investments Limited. Well, I Googled it, and I found nothing. The only place that this name of this company was online was in the campaign finance disclosure statements of Vision Vancouver. It had essentially been a secret company until then. And then what I found when I did a company search is that this company is actually Joel Solomon's company, one of his companies. And now Joel Solomon, another thing that surprised me was, of course, he's known here in Vancouver as a millionaire philanthropist, having created his own charity and giving away money. He says he's been the largest funder of the environmental movement in British Columbia. So I was quite surprised when I saw in the tax returns that, in fact, he's been paid a salary, $186,000 salary in 2009 by the charity that supposedly he had founded.
Why does a person who is himself some sort of millionaire, why does he need a salary?
Yeah. Not only that, but the same charity had paid the salaries at all of the staff at his investment firm. So what kind of investment firm is funded to the tune of $2.3 million by a charity?
And what is Renewal Partners? That's yet another company.
Yes, that's the other investment firm.
Yeah.
So there are two investment firms, Renewal Partners and Interdependent Investments, and then three PR companies, one of which is owned by the chief of staff, Mike McGee. Okay,
Yes.
So you have got Strategic Communications, Convergence Communications, and Communicopia. So my question is that are these investment firms and PR companies sort of intermediaries, right? And of course, this question has been put to the mayor several times, and he doesn't answer the question. he answers another question. He says, no, Vision Vancouver isn't funded by charities. Well, that's a no-brainer. You only have to read the campaign finance disclosure statements to know that. And obviously that's for good reason, right? Charities are not allowed to fund political parties.
Right.
My question is, have they gotten around this by doing it through these PR firms and investment companies?
I'm the executive director of a nonprofit society, and our board has deliberately chosen to not be a charitable tax receipt giving organization because our mandate is political. Our mandate is to promote something. Doesn't matter what it is, but so we know we can't do that. Okay, certainly these folks have lawyers or are lawyers. They must know. Look, there's a terrible thing about optics. When we think of a company hiding a company and a company inside a company and all these Ukrainian dolls fitting into each other as different companies and different charities, we think of Bernie Madoff. You know, we don't think of charitable foundations. There's something very odd about all of that.
Yeah. Well,
what's the need for it?
Exactly. The interesting thing is, you know, if you look at the timing of when Mayor Gregor Robertson entered politics, okay, it was in 2004 or 2005.
Right.
At the same time, there were several other things going on that are quite interesting. One is Warren Buffett started funding Tides. Warren Buffett has paid $26 million to Tides over the years.
Yikes.
$12 million of that went to what they call the Indigenous Leadership Awards program. That program has given checks of $25,000 to First Nations leaders here in British Columbia, and the Haida, the Heiltsuk, and others. That money can be traced directly to Warren Buffett. Okay?
Yes.
Now, at the same time, Tides was also funding a very ambitious project called the Apollo Alliance. Its goal was to foster U.S. energy security and the competitiveness of the U.S. economy. The goal of the Apollo Alliance was to stimulate $300 billion in American investment to foster the domestic U.S. energy supply. Of course, this is not that long after 9/11, and the Americans were, and rightly so, concerned about weaning themselves off of foreign oil. So at the same time that Tides, around 2004, at the same time that Tides is running this project called the Apollo Alliance, right, to foster American energy independence, that's around the same time that the Hewlett Foundation funded Tides Canada to create a strategic plan to address oil and gas development in British Columbia. My question is, what is the strategic plan? Does it involve the creation of the Great Bear Rainforest, which has become a de facto trade barrier? It's become the great trade barrier to Canadian energy exports to Asia. Did the plan involve putting Mayor Gregor Robertson into politics?
Well, apparently it did, because I'm looking for this. Oh, here it is. Here is Joel Solomon, saying to the Huffington Post that the election of Mayor Robertson was the result of nearly 20 years of moving in a purposeful direction.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, you know, David,
when Gregor Robertson was this big and drinking juice before Happy Planet, that somebody was planning, let's groom this guy to be the mayor of Vancouver.
No.
What does that mean?
He would have been well in his 20s by that point.
Okay.
He was, you know, no, he was well on his way. But here's the thing, David. My blog is called Fair Questions.
Yes.
Because I don't have all the answers. But what I think I've done is
You've asked some tough questions.
Put together a series of questions that need to be put to the mayor. You know, in the previous municipal election in 2011, the Vancouver Sun tried to ask him this. He avoided the question. So I think now, especially, that the mayor has come out so strongly, not only against tanker traffic, but also against the shipment of coal. You know, his motion to block expansion of infrastructure that would allow exports of coal through Vancouver ports, that is also, the whole movement is also funded by the same foundations. Natural gas. These foundations are also against the development of natural gas.
On Cortes Island, Hollyhock, which is a sort of intellectual and physical retreat, a place where people spa out in many different ways. Yeah,
it's a charity.
Yeah,
it has charitable status.
But it's run and or owned by Joel Solomon, and
I think.
Yeah, and why did Tides buy a piece of property that's almost adjacent to Hollyhock and almost adjacent to private property that the mayor owns?
Yeah, not almost, directly adjacent.
Directly adjacent.
So Tides, around the same time that Mayor Gregor Robertson.
It's all very convenient.
It is. So the same years that he went into municipal politics, Tides bought a $2 million, 150-acre piece of oceanfront that quite nicely extends the mayor's beachfront. Now my question is, Tides in 2009, when the U.S. is in financial crisis, of all the places in the world where Tides could purchase a $2 million park, why Cortez Island, where there already are 2 provincial parks? There are only 900 residents. Why not a homeless shelter in Vancouver? Is Cortez Island really the place in the world where we need a $2 million park? Is that why there? Why right next door to the mayor?
What do you think this is all about? We've just got a minute and a half left. What do you think for Mr. Solomon and his many arms of his many companies? What's this got to do really with Gregor Robertson? What do you think?
I let them speak for themselves. You should have him on his show.
But they won't speak to you. The mayor has given you a few perfunctory emails,
yes,
but has refused to sit down with you.
I have not had the opportunity to speak to him, no. But the big leagues in the media need to talk to the mayor about this, especially now that he has come out so strongly against not only the tanker traffic, but also the exports of coal from Alberta and British Columbia, and also I think some of it would originate from the United States. These issues have major economic impacts for our country.
Absolutely.
And so I think we have a right to ask. The first question I would ask is simply asking whether the CRA is looking into the Enswell Foundation. I'd be curious to know that.
Have you found, with just about a minute left, have you found any trace of American intelligence forces involved in these American charities? In other words, is there any trace whatsoever to be completely paranoid that the CIA or anybody else, that Homeland Security or anybody else has interests?
That's quite a question, David. I think we can start with the publicly available documents, the strategy papers. I think anyone that is concerned about the development of natural resources in Canada, especially natural gas, the thing I'm most concerned about now, should read the documents, like read the New Energy for America document that the Apollo Alliance produced.
Right.
Read Drilling Deeper, okay? That's the strategy against natural gas. Read some of these papers and decide for yourself.
And do what you've done, which is look at the tax receipts and the tax returns. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Excellent work. Good for you.
Thank you, David.
We need more of this. Good questions asked. And we'll leave it to the folks involved to try and give answers. All right, next week, folks, one of the most amazing people in our community, if you haven't met him yet, you're in for a delight. His name is Donovan Tilsley, and he's a Paralympic athlete. He's been the flag bearer in Olympic Games. He's a young man. He's, I think, 26 or 27. He's a buddy of mine, and you're going to love him. He'll bring lots of photos of he's won medals all over the world at Paralympic Games. So that's it for us. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for joining us here on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. Good night.